My name is Holly Haynes. I am completing this documentary to fulfill a public engagement project requirement for the course Halifax in the World at Dalhousie University. We were asked to engage the public about an event or issue to incite reflection about Halifax in the world. I have deviated a little off course and chose something that was neither an event or an issue, but rather something greater. What is the biggest influence on society? It has to be the media. From our early newspapers to radio, television, and now social media, Halifax's media has affected the people of Nova Scotia and informed and influenced the world. When Halifax was founded in 1749 under Governor Edward Cornwallis, a group of settlers came to this country with hopes and dreams about owning land, with little idea about the hardships that would follow. With the settlers still on the ships, the first murder occurred on August 26th, and 5 days later, the first trial in one of the few buildings in Halifax occurred. Peter Carcel was found guilty and was hung 2 days later on September 2nd, 1749, at the end of George Street. This newsworthy event did not make the newspaper. In fact, the new city did not have a building or a printing press for a newspaper. The settlers did not get to hear that the trial of Peter Carcel was maybe less than justice served. Edward Cornwallis and 6 other councillors, none of which had legal training, served as the general court. Carcel had no lawyer to represent him. 3 years later, on March 23rd of 1752, John Burchell produced the first newspaper in Halifax, the Halifax Gazette, from a shop on Grafton Street. In fact, the Halifax Gazette was the first newspaper in Canada, and only one copy still exists. It was purchased by Library and Archives Canada from the Massachusetts Historical Society in Boston. If you ever have had the chance to go and read an old newspaper from over 100 years ago, do it. Just once. These newspapers give us an insight into where we came from, better than any textbook. So, have I piqued your interest? This is where you can go to view those papers in person. It is the Public Archives of Nova Scotia. If you can't make it to Halifax, thanks to modern technology, take the time to look online. The archives have 163,000 digitized pages, including the Acadian Recorder and their coverage of the War of 1812, the Atlantic Advocate, which carried news important to African Nova Scotian readers, Gaelic newspapers from Cape Breton, and Le Courrier de la Nouvelle-Écosse, a French-language newspaper. But if you do get the chance to come in, do it. I remember the first time I did. I was maybe 10 at the time and was looking for something very specific on microfilm. I had the date of it being published, which generally makes it very easy to locate. Rolling microfilm looking for something near the middle of the roll. I, being the young kid I was, complained that my arm was very sore from turning the crank on the machine. My mother directed my attention to an elderly gentleman a few machines away who had been turning for some time without any complaint. The gentleman was going much faster than myself, and to this day his will inspires me to keep researching history. I hope someday that you all take interest in local history and get to visit the Nova Scotia Public Archives. Take a walk up University Avenue and go to the Dalhousie Archives, where the oldest college paper is stored. The Dalhousie Gazette was first published on January 25th of 1869. The media is a way society can educate, encourage thoughtful debate, and celebrate our culture. This video will look at some of the biggest stories covered in our Halifax media and how they not only enlightened the audience, but influenced and changed media and the world. In fact, the first and maybe most important story that I need to tell is a story about the media and the libel trial of Joseph Howe. Joseph Howe was honored this year on Nova Scotia Heritage Day. He started printing the Nova Scotian in 1828, acting as its editor until 1841. The Nova Scotian covered debates in the House of Assembly and the court cases in the city. He also published his own travel writings and provincial literature, such as Thomas Haliburton's The Clockmaker's Sayings and The Doings of Sam Slick. Joseph Howe began a campaign against the corrupt government and printed a letter in 1835, talking about corrupt magistrates pocketing public funds. The magistrates pressured the courts to prosecute Howe for criminal libel. Howe consulted with lawyers, but no one would take on his case. On March 2nd of 1835, a bench of judges and a 12-man jury were assembled to hear the case. Howe's personal defense highlighted the truthfulness of the article and the fact that his motives were not to disrupt the peace. The jury disregarded the judge's opinion and found Howe not guilty. Howe wrote in the Nova Scotian that the press is free, yet no reference is made to Howe's trial with regards to freedom of the press, and the law remained unchanged until 1873, when the truth of a statement can be used as defense for libel. It was ironic that 1873 was also the year of Howe's death. In 1891, the first of the major Spring Hill mining accidents occurred. An explosion occurred on the 1,900-foot level of the number 1 slope, which was also connected into the number 2 slope. At the bottom of pit number 1, a half a mile from the origin of the blast, were 11 miners who were the closest to the explosion site to survive. Nova Scotia was quick to respond with medical help and volunteers to mount an underground rescue. Unfortunately, many miners did perish due to the toxic fumes, and the rescue was halted until the mine could be ventilated. The tragedy resulted in 125 dead, but due to the media coverage of the tragedy, donations came in from across Canada and the United States to assist those that were left behind. Many people in present-day society know of the Titanic as being a major motion picture featuring actor Leonardo DiCaprio. Who knew that one of the biggest media events in 1912 was the launching and eventual sinking of the unsinkable ship, the Titanic? The importance of this news event is the fact that ever since the disaster, there are still stories being reported. In 2002, the story of a father who kidnapped his children from their mother and left on the ill-fated Titanic for America is just one example. He is buried in Halifax, but the story has a silver lining in that the 2 young boys survived. Because of the news reports of the time, their mother saw their picture and they were reunited. Many of the dead were buried in Halifax cemeteries, and Halifax was one of the initial signs of relief to the surviving passengers. In the early midst of one of the largest disasters in Halifax, not all early reporting was factually correct. On December 6th of 1917, Halifax was devastated by an explosion. News stories circulated around the world. The nature of the disaster damaged the communication between Halifax and the rest of the world. Death toll numbers varied greatly from 300 or 350 to reports that expected them to rise close to 1,200 in American newspapers. While it is believed that close to 2,000 were killed and 9,000 injured, many newspapers blamed sabotage and did not even report the correct country of origin of the ships involved. Many newspapers reported that the ship's crews died in the explosion, which we know was not accurate. The local papers tried to dispel the false stories and focused on helping people by listing dead, missing, found, and injured, and news of relief. The local papers also published stories of human interest such as Vincent Coleman and Ashpan Annie Welsh. The importance of these news stories is to showcase that in the face of disaster, error can occur because of shock, anguish, confusion, and the compulsion to report something. During the night, at approximately 11 p.m. on April 12, 1936, Moose River, Nova Scotia, a mine collapsed, trapping 3 men. While this story seems relatively small in comparison to the previous stories and events, it captivated the entire world. This story had the plot of a movie. The 3 men were inspecting the mine when the ceiling collapsed. They were the mine timekeeper and the 2 mine owners. One was the chief of staff at Toronto's Hospital for Sick Children, and the other a lawyer from Toronto. Billy Bell was part of the rescue team drilling into an opening 6 days later, where he shouted down the pipe, only to hear no response. Officials wanted to call off the search, but Billy remained, and when a steam whistle was used, a faint tapping was heard. On the morning of April 20th, one of the mine owners died of pneumonia, and the rescue operations continued to look bleak. There appeared to only be one way to rescue the men through the dangerous Reynolds shaft. J. Frank Willis, part of the Canadian Radio Broadcasting Commission, was not given permission to cover the story on the radio until Monday, April 20th, due mainly to the fact that radio was considered an entertainment medium. At 6 p.m. on April 20th, Willis made his first broadcast, and for 2 minutes every half hour, Willis was live throughout North America. Willis would report for 56 hours straight in North America's very first live 24-hour news event, changing radio and, in fact, media itself. On November 1st, 1956, the town of Spring Hill felt the underground explosion that would signal another mining disaster. While the media reports were saying that there was little hope in rescues, draggermen and miners felt that they could rescue some of them. 2 draggermen would die during the rescue attempt, overcome by fumes. The fumes were deadly in the mines and would normally result in the death of many miners. Yet some miners survived by being on the floor where there was a pocket of breathable air, and other miners used air from compressed air hoses to create a fresh air pocket. In total, there were 88 men rescued and 39 dead. This event was covered by local and some national media, but larger international stories resulted in this disaster being virtually ignored by the international media. Another Spring Hill mine disaster would occur, just 2 years later, on October 23, 1958. On October 23rd at approximately 8 p.m., a severe bump resembling an earthquake rocked the mine, and by 4 a.m. on October 24th, 75 men were rescued. Media from around the world traveled to report the disaster. The disaster was famous for being the first major international event to appear in a live television broadcast on the CBC. On October 29th, 12 survivors were located behind a rockfall and were eventually rescued on October 30th. Various dignitaries visited the rescue site, including Robert Stanfield and His Royal Highness Prince Philip. 7 more survivors were found on November 1st, but unfortunately the rest were not so lucky. The disaster resulted in the death of 74 of the 174 miners trapped. This is just one example of how a large human interest story in the media garnering worldwide attention. When discussing news stories, we would be remiss if the call heard around the world by Foster Hewitt was not discussed. The Summit Series in 1972 spellbound the nation, and Halifax was no exception. A battle on ice between Russia and Canada saw some blood, sweat, and tears. Ian Thompson, a reporter for the Chronicle Herald, who traveled on vacation to Moscow, filled game reports for the newspaper. While the media covered local events, they also covered international events of interest to our citizens. In the early 1980s, Lyndon McIntyre, an investigative reporter for the Fifth Estate, applied to the Supreme Court to gain access to search warrants used by the RCMP to seize Liberal political party finance records. These records would be used to convict 2 Liberal fundraisers of influence peddling. It was ruled that warrants and records related to completed searches were public documents. The Court's Appeal Division ruled that the records of all searches should be open to scrutiny. It was also stated that the public could be present when search warrants were issued. The ruling was appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada, which clarified the ruling, which declared the search warrant records were public documents, but only after a search was conducted and evidence was seized. They ruled that when issuing search warrants they must be held in private, to stop the possible chance of evidence being hidden or destroyed. The judge was given the power to seal a search warrant if their release would jeopardize a case or the identity of an informant. The McIntyre ruling was a landmark case that changed the Criminal Code of Canada and gave rights to journalists and the public in general. At 5:18 a.m. on May 9, 1992, 26 men were trapped in the Westray mine after a massive explosion. Television covered the disaster for all the world to see. From the dragoman who launched the rescue attempt, the 11 bodies found on May 10th, 4 more bodies over the next few days, to finally calling off the search, all made headlines. The mine was sealed and would not reopen. The media covered the awarding of medals of bravery to the 96 dragomen and workers that attempted the rescue, along with the public inquiry which was to follow in 1995. Charges were laid against Westray's owner, Correa Incorporated, and 2 mine managers, but the charges were dropped after a lengthy trial, and the trial was never resumed. There are papers written concerning the relationship between the mine owners, the media, and the families. A paper by Trudy Richards concluded that Correa Incorporated demonstrated a reluctance to cooperate with the media and an insensitivity towards the families of the miners, which negatively affected the company's public image. This lack of open, prompt, and accessible communication between the media and the company contributed to the suspicion that the company had something to hide. The paper also highlighted the fact that the journalists rely on human interest to tell their stories. This disaster illustrated a need for public relations and crisis communication plans for companies. Media needs to determine the facts and cut down on speculation that could harm society. While it is hard in the face of disasters of this magnitude to try to not find someone to blame, the media has a responsibility to report and, more importantly, investigate the disaster. In 2014, a news story reported that a lab worker tested the ash content in the mine dust and reported it to the mine managers that very day. So in fact, there was something hidden. Yet these results did not become public knowledge in 1992. In 1998, one of the biggest and most heartbreaking news stories of human loss affected the people of Nova Scotia. Swiss Air 111 crashed off of Peggy's Cove, killing all passengers and crew in a devastating airplane crash. Halifax would be inundated with family members, officials, and media traveling to Peggy's Cove. The media covered the story from the grief of the families, the compassion of Nova Scotians, and the recovery effort that had retrieved about 1 million pieces of wreckage. This story also resulted in a court battle for the release of air traffic control tapes, which went to the Supreme Court of Canada. These tapes were released in 2007 that pushed the idea of freedom of the press with the personal nature of these tapes. While these tapes would be difficult to hear, this ruling would give insights and give rights to the Canadian press that the United States press had achieved years earlier. While the air traffic control tapes were made public, Canada still legally denies the press access to the cockpit voice recordings, which are considered private. The investigation did determine the cause of the disaster, insulation, and an onboard fire. This event still haunts Nova Scotians and left a lasting memory for the first responders, counselors, armed forces, investigators, and the media. While the media is to report the news to inform the public, we, the public, need to remember that they themselves are human, and are therefore affected by the very nature of what they report, both tragedy and triumph. 9/11. Saying it still gives me chills. No question that it was one of the biggest stories in 2001 as it folded out on television. This televised a second plane flying into the Second World Trade Center. While the story happened in New York, it influenced the entire world. This act of terrorism that showed the worst in humanity also showed generosity, as Halifax and other cities took in thousands of airline passengers. The media helped in the healing of the nation and of the world. In 2013, Nova Scotians learned the horrors of social media and the fact that every individual that posts on social media is in fact part of the media. While people give very little care to what's posted online, social media is in fact a very powerful form of journalism with very little regulation. The Rehtaeh Parsons story explains just that. Rehtaeh was victimized during a party and a sexually explicit photo was made public through social media. While many Nova Scotians felt that this was a form of cyberbullying, there was very little legally that could be done. Rehtaeh committed suicide in 2013 after the bullying, and the boys involved were charged with distributing child pornography as minors. The ironic thing was that Rehtaeh's and the boys' names were not made public because they were minors at the time of the incident. They posted on social media something that could be shared 1,000,000 times over, and the effects of that would never be erased. Yet in the eyes of the court, they received the right to not have their names mentioned. At the age of 17, these young people are determined fit to drive a motor vehicle, yet according to our justice code, cannot be named when they are charged for a crime. Rehtaeh's name was also removed from the child porn case as a youth victim, yet media still gave her name. A court later ruled that no persecution of the media would occur as long as the name was not used in a derogatory sense, stating that the law was in place to protect the victim. The other alarming issue was that the innocent until proven guilty on the part of the boys was not felt through the media. Perhaps if their names were used, the media might have reported the story differently. The story was heard around the world, resulting in a cyberbullying law that would later be struck down by the Nova Scotia Supreme Court. While the law was struck down, we still as a society have to understand and realize the powerful nature of the media when used incorrectly, whether it be by educated journalists or on social media by teenagers. I would like to end my media stories with my thoughts on a controversial topic in the media today about a part of Nova Scotia's heritage, the Cornwallis statue. It needs to stay for many reasons. Cornwallis did found the city of Halifax as a British outpost. He did put a bounty on the native people's scalps, but the statue should stand as a symbol of the triumphs and tragedies of our history, and a beacon of the change that we want to see in the world. Maybe more importantly, we need to remember all humans are flawed. Nobody is perfect. Instead of seeing what's wrong with the world and blaming it on those that came before us, let's look at how we can positively affect the change. We cannot and should not try to erase history. We think of things like concentration camps and how they symbolize the atrocities of Hitler. However, they also symbolize the strength and resilience of his victims. Media through Nova Scotia's history has covered important issues, such as immigration, segregation, racism, prohibition, and women's right to vote, to provincial interest stories such as the lore of Oak Island. Without the media, where would we be as a society? How do we push media forward in a constructive way? Maybe it is by looking backwards. Many feel to look at a paper or watch a TV news broadcast today, all you see on the front page and hear at the lead stories is the evils of society. Perhaps because, well, that's what sells. Maybe the media have a responsibility to portray positive human interest stories on the front page and as the lead stories in the news, just as much as the evils of society. More importantly, shouldn't we as a society demand that? Everyone has the capacity to influence the world and to speak to the world. While it's important to initiate debate and provoke thoughtful reflection, it is equally important to showcase the positive and think before we speak. When evaluating history, we have to remember it's just that. It's history. It was not us that were scalped, or a bounty put on our heads, or evicted from our homes because we spoke French, or our land expropriated for a railway, a fortress, or a bridge. It might have been our ancestors, but it was not us. They have the right to complain, but remember there are two sides to every story. People say you study history to stop making the mistakes of the past. But unless when we study an issue, we try to see it from both sides of the story, we are not really learning. While it is difficult to see the opposite sides of some issues, we need to. For without doing that, aren't we just perpetuating a never-ending cycle? But remember, it is hard to judge those times as black and white. Instead, we need to see all of the colors in between. For we didn't walk in their shoes, face their responsibilities, or their living conditions. We need to, instead of blaming others, creating things that cause disunity, to look at things that we all need to face. The idea of media is that they report the news fairly and impartially, but with social media today, we need to remember that we are all reporters, and the story like history never truly goes away if someone remembers it. We must realize that we need to remember all history, the good, the bad, and the ugly, for without the people that came before, we would not have this life that we are living right here and right now.